It's 2 Friday, the 14th of May. You're listening to The Modern Conservative on iHeartRadio. You can also find the program on YouTube, Spotify, and now Audible. Well, recently, the Australian Curriculum and Reporting Authority released a draft proposal of its changes to the national curriculum, with the hope of returning Australia to the top of the world education ladder. Among the hundreds of proposed changes, one area of change has fueled an avalanche of public debate. Under the new proposed changes, students would be taught that some Indigenous Australians regard the country's national holiday as Invasion Day, and that the colonisation of Australia by the British was perceived by Indigenous Australians as an invasion. It also proposes the term Indigenous Australians be changed to First Nations people. Here to talk to me about this is ACARA's Chief Executive Officer, David de Carvalho, and Indigenous leader, Warren Mundine. David, what was ACARA's reason for the changing of this language?
Hello, Nick, and hi, Warren. Nice to be with you this afternoon for this discussion. Look, I think the first thing that we wanted to say in the change around at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority was that we had very strong advice from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory group, which is chaired by Professor Mark Rose, who is well known to Warren, that we really needed to have a look at telling the whole story of Australia as part of the education of our young people. And what we've said in the key organising ideas for that cross-curriculum priority was to call attention to the fact that for many Indigenous people, the experience of the arrival of Europeans in this country in 1788 was experienced, was perceived, not necessarily as an entirely benevolent event. And as Noel Pearson put it recently, the view from the ship may have been one of settlement, but the view from the shore was one of invasion. And so we're not saying that it definitely was invasion. We're calling attention to the experience and the perception. And core concepts in history go to the issue of perception and interpretation. And what the change is meant to reflect is calling attention to this experience and these perceptions.
Warren, what are your concerns with these changes?
I'm not concerned about the invasion one at all. It is, it is about looking, as David said, is looking at what from the ship to the shore. Now, it's like someone turns up in your backyard, then invites all their mates in to take over your house, and that's an invasion. And that's a perception from the house owner, and that's a perception that Indigenous people have about that it was an invasion. And while from the other side, you have a colonial experience, you've got several hundred years of that, of way Europeans, well, it wasn't only Europeans, it was also Arabs and other people who looked at these things as colonisation and looking at these things as a process for them for their empires. So it's a So look, the invasion, I don't have a problem with that, because it is the fact of history. This is how Indigenous people seen things, and this is how Europeans and other people who come to this country seen it in a different way. And to me, let's look at the historic facts and talk about it.
Yeah, look, I completely agree, and I think it's healthy to educate students about the realities of what did happen in ways that I wasn't educated when I was at that age. But I think it would also be a little bit naive of us not to acknowledge that there is political activism at the moment attached to the word invasion. And just like changing the date of Australia Day, I'm not 100% convinced it will actually do anything to ameliorate what I guess some might call far more serious issues that the Indigenous community is facing. Warren, I guess I'll ask you, do you think that changing the language here will help current and future generations of Indigenous people relieve any of the anguish over the past?
Look, language is important. Language, you're putting out an idea. You're putting out a perception of things when you talk about, when you use certain words and certain languages. Look, there's no doubt that there are some political activism around this in regard to the arguments about Invasion Day, or invasion, it was an invasion or was a peaceful colonisation, and that. I think a lot of people get caught up with the Australia Day. Now, I've written about this and I've given speeches about it. I'm one of the people who strongly believe in changes the day. Because I believe that, you know, like Independence Day in the United States, it should be on the day when they actually declared independence. But the only problem with that is the 1st of January in 1901, when it happened, is we've already got a holiday for that. Being good Australians, we don't want to give up another holiday. But Australia Day is always going to be, you know, the 26th of January, it's always going to be an important day and you can't ignore it. And the reason for that is because that's the day after Phillip sailed into, Sydney Harbour, and the colony really kicked off in New South Wales and across Australia. And that's, so you can't ignore that historical fact. And it's also going to be very important to both sides to recognise that. And it's also very important that a lot of descendants who live in Australia today are descendants of those people who come out as convicts and come out as the Marines and other people on that ship. And so we really, I think anyone who thinks that you can just bury that day, then you're really wasting your time, because it is a historical, important day.
And David, we've spoken about this off air. One of the issues at the moment is that we have such a divided and, let's say, loud far left and far right. So on one hand, we have the idea that the Australian curriculum is under attack. Christianity is under attack because of some of these suggestions. But on the other hand, you also have what I would consider to be a somewhat dangerous movement that is Black Lives Matter. And there is some concern that the early influence that this might have in children to get involved in social activism can be tied into this global movement.
Look, I think you're right, Nick. Unfortunately, in Australia, we seem to be moving in a direction that a lot of other Western nations are moving in, where increasingly there's a form of social and political polarisation, which makes reasoned civil debate about a whole range of important political issues really difficult. And we tend to have these Twitter wars with people sort of throwing, 140 character, barbs at one another, but there's no real engagement. Everybody's talking past one another. And I really hope that we haven't reached the tipping point beyond which there is a point of no return. I do think education plays a really important role in trying to hold society together. And that is, in a sense, partly the intention in the revisions to try and strike the right balance. Now, obviously, these are draft revisions. People have different views about whether we have struck the right balance. We will certainly be listening to all the feedback that we are getting and give consideration to that feedback before we make any final recommendations to ministers towards the end of the year.
Warren, you've spoken recently you've criticised recently the American movement and idea of critical race theory. Do you see this having any impact on Australia in our schooling?
Yes, look, the critical race theory, we've seen it just recently in two references. One was in Victoria, where from outside the school system come in and gave a talk and asked the white boys in the class to stand up, and then that put across a viewpoint that white males were the oppressors, and they were the ones who, for a lot of problems in the world, they were the ones who did that. Another one, of course, is in Sydney, where people put up posters in regard to the Black Lives Matter program, and they were really attacking the police. And I think in both cases they were wrong. The first one is in regard to in the Victorian case, is that it showed a total misunderstanding of historical facts. If you're talking about white people as the ones who took slaves to the United States, well, that's true. But then you've got to also recognise you'd be very hard pressed to find any society in the world over historical times who didn't have slaves. You had the Arabs had slaves, the Arab empires, the Ottomans had slaves, the Chinese empire had slaves. You had a whole wide range of people who had done these things. So looking at this as a black and white issue, and I had many discussions with many people who said to me, well, Warren, you're a victim. You are a person of colour. You have been oppressed. You just need to look in the mirror and accept that. And I just find that a crazy thing. As soon as you start talking about race as a collective, people are then put down as an oppressor, and other people are put down as victims, then you really start running a bit of a race card here. And that's major concerns in this area. And the other one of the Black Lives Matter stuff, in the Black Lives Matter campaign in Australia, and I'm talking specifically about Australia, where you're talking about the deaths in custody, 400 and something people who died. I had a friend of mine ring me and say, what are police and corrective services killing these people? And I said that, and I showed that it wasn't, that's not true, because I did the inquiry into adult prisons in South Australia, and the vast majority of those people who died in prisons died of natural causes, died of, they were killed by another a prisoner. They had drug and alcohol issues which caused their death. And it was only a tiny, very tiny minority which were had deaths at the hands of police and corrective services. So you look at the John Pat issue in Roebourne, where he was beaten to death. You look at the Boomadgee case in Palm Island, and you look at and a lot of other things were the improper processes that were done in this area, such as the Mr. Ward death in Western Australia, who was driven across the desert in a back of a corrective services van, and and the air conditioning was broken and he roasted to death. Dreadful death, no excuses. That was incompetence, and the processes that the corrective services office use there has now been changed. So I think when you start getting to this activism, I don't mind people talking about these issues, but let's open these things up to a sensible conversation. And the first thing is, why are people in jail? And when you look at the statistics, and this is what we found in South Australia, 56% of the Aboriginals who were in jail were there for serious violent crimes. So it wasn't like this whole racist oppression was going on in the current systems. Yes, we need to look back in history and see how police, in the film Rabbit Creek Fence, how police were used to enforce the Aboriginal protection laws, the Aboriginal welfare laws, and the protector for Aboriginals, and keeping Aboriginals oppressed through that whole system. But then we must also look at, since the 1970s, how things have totally changed.
Yeah, I mean, you talked there at the beginning about standing up and apologising for whiteness. And I think that at the core of this, the problem is that the idea of social justice is, of course, completely ambiguous. And when we look at the rationale, David, I'll give you a chance to also talk about how you were misquoted, or at least James Morrow from the Daily Telegraph didn't quite reveal the fullness of truth. But in the rationale that you mentioned, it says that Australia is a secular nation with a multicultural and multi-faith society and a Christian heritage, and promotes the development of inclusivity by students' understanding of broader values such as respect, civility, equity, justice, and responsibility. But I think that we could all agree that these values are completely subjective. And really, we're entering into the territory of moral philosophy here, which of course is not settled science. So I guess my question, David, is how can the education system define a value like respect? Shouldn't that be the role of parents rather than teachers?
Well, I'll come back to the statement in the rationale. Yes, we are constitutionally a secular country, and constitutionally simply means, when I say secular, there is a kind of a formal separation of church and state. But you must remember that the issue of values in education is really important. If you go back to 2004, for example, when Prime Minister Howard was making a strong case for the teaching of Australian values, which included many of the things that you just read out in that list.
We're in a very different time than 2004, though, right now, when we're talking about social justice. It's a very different climate.
Oh, yes, it is. I'm simply making the point that the issue of the connection between education and values more broadly is not a new issue. Certainly the context has changed. In terms of the words or the terminology social justice, as a Catholic, I'm somewhat annoyed that it's been hijacked, because it's a term that goes right back hundreds of years as through the social encyclicals of people like Pope Leo XIII, and then more recently Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, where social justice is at the heart of the tradition, and is at the heart of the tradition of Catholic schooling as well. So it's a bit disingenuous for people to say that education should be a value-free zone. What we do have to be careful about is that the debates about what constitute the appropriate formation of young people in values does not turn into if you like, indoctrination of political views of adults. Hannah Arendt, in particular, was very clear on this point, that she was explicitly eschewed the temptation of what she referred to as revolutionary movements of a tyrannical caste, to use education as a system or a form of political indoctrination. Now, obviously, we don't want to go down that path, but to say that education has nothing to do with the inculcation of respect and community, these kinds of things, and frankly, support for democratic principles would be an odd thing in a country like Australia.
I don't think anyone's suggesting that. And you quoted Pope Benedict XVI, who also, of course, wrote about modern relativism. And that's really the heart of what I'm getting into here. If we're values such as justice, responsibility, and respect, these are transient, right? It depends on who's teaching them, whose justice it is, who respects who. Warren, what's your take on this?
It is, over the years, there has been a shift especially in the last 15 years, 20 years, there's a big shift in the way people use terms. Like I always laugh at that. And I had a challenge from a person who was a lawyer who was in Antifa, and he said to me, I said, well, Antifa is just this body out there of a group of people who just they just do violence and burn towns down and do dreadful stuff. And he said, what, are you against anti-fascism? And I said, I'm not against anti-fascism. I'm very much against fascism. And he said, well, Antifa its name's anti-fascism. And so you get this play on words, and And David just talked about, like the social justice, and I'm a Catholic as well. And so it has a real strong meaning.
3 Catholics right here.
Yeah, boy, we've got the troika.
I don't know if you can see I think you can see the catechisms behind me, actually.
Right, and so it is about how people are using these words, and it's like this Black Lives Matters movement. You say, well, of course, Black Lives Matters, and all lives matter. White lives matter, Asian lives matter, everyone life does matter, but they try and catch you out when you. In regard to the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is one of the problems that we're having with the whole wide range of things. And of course, I went to a Catholic school. So, look, I don't have a thing against teaching values in a school system because they're important, but they need to be, and in the Catholic school, it's very much about those Christian values of Jesus Christ and about how you and that, while and also the philosophers and theologians over the time talking about these things. And one of the things that we taught is love and respect for everyone. Now it doesn't mean it does mean that even if they're not of our faith, they are all God's children, and we should be treating people with that love and that respect. The problem we're having today is a lot of that's been hijacked. And of course, we are a secular society. It says so in our constitution, but we're also a democratic liberal democracy. And in that, and a lot of people don't know what that really means. And they need to learn about that. And what that means is that, we have, freedoms, freedom of faith. You could be an atheist, or you can be a Christian or a Muslim or Buddhist, or you could be a Hare Krishna or whatever, and that is and so we don't have those religious laws which Europe and other places and Africa and other places had over time, and that's why I think those type of things need to be taught in regard to what exactly a liberal democracy is. How we treat one another in a liberal democracy, the process of law, the principle of innocent until proven guilty. These type of civic stuff are very important because that's the foundation of the society in it. Is it, as I think it was Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of governance in the history of mankind until you look at all the rest. And yes, it's not perfect, but it's always evolving, it's always changing. But I think people should learn about where those ideas come from, the arguments and debates over the centuries, because to be quite frank, the society we have today is really a modern, very short period of history when you compare the length of humanity. But it's a society that we've evolved into because of all the problems and all the issues that have happened in the past. And so I think people should really learn about these things, learn about how we improve. I always find it interesting that people say that Australia is a racist country, but I find it interesting that people who are always escaping oppression always want to come to Australia, and people, and I always find it funny that since the 1970s we've have any racist law in this country, and I'm not saying that there weren't problems in the past, and we need to learn about those problems. We need to talk about those issues, but we also need to talk about how, as a society, we've improved and learnt the lessons of those.
Okay, well, I'll let you go, but David, I'll give you an opportunity just to clarify the process now of how this, the proposed curriculum, what it goes through, just so perhaps people will calm down a little bit.
That'd be good. Thank you. Thanks very much, Nick. Look, I think, one of the things you mentioned before, some slight misrepresentation in the media about what we've done. So, for example, in a recent media article, there was a suggestion that we had removed reference to the kinds of democratic freedoms that Warren has just been talking about, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, that they'd been removed from the curriculum. Well, they hadn't. They've just been moved from year 8 to year 7. Now, had the journalist actually rung us to seek clarification on this point, we would have informed him of that, but we didn't get the opportunity to make that piece of information clear. The other point that I think that Warren has made, which I really want to support and which comes through, is this issue of not wanting to, bifurcate the world into good and evil, depending on what colour you are. So, for example, if you're looking at the anti-slavery movement, people like William Wilberforce, who was a white Christian, was a driving force behind getting rid of the slave trade. We have kept, as you started at the start of the show, reference to a Christian heritage. Now, what people have tended to zero in on is one content description in the whole of the curriculum, the proposed curriculum, which did remove reference to Christian heritage. Now, that was done in an effort to be more inclusive and descriptive about the current society. But we've had a lot of feedback about that, and again, as I say, we'll take this feedback seriously. Again, the question of have we got the balance right? These are all things that we're taking on board. The reason that these draft proposals are out there is precisely to get this feedback. This is not a fait accompli. We want to hear from the community. So the draft proposals are out for comment until the 8th of July. And people can go to our consultation website, which is australiancurriculum.edu.au/consultation. And there they can either make very specific comments and feed in a very specific survey about particular syllabuses, particular curriculums, or they can leave general comments. But what I really urge people to do is familiarise themselves with what is actually in the curriculum rather than what they've just heard from reading the newspapers as to what is in the curriculum. Because I think people will see that it's not necessarily the case, many of the suggestions that have been made about us sort of airbrushing Christian heritage out of the curriculum, for example, is just not true.
It takes time to read through that stuff, and people are not prepared to do that. So obviously the website is there. So perhaps rather than posting tweets, you can get on that website and make some useful recommendations and suggestions. Yeah. Gentlemen, I really appreciate both of you coming on the program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And I love your artwork in the background.
Thanks very much, Warren, from the Northern Territory. Yeah, okay.